Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Ember webinar launching the Global Electricity Review of 2024. This is our 6th annual Global Electricity Review, and we believe it provides the first really comprehensive look back at what happened in the global electricity in the previous year. I'm Richard Black. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy with Ember. And we're going to be walking you through some of the key findings of the report and then discussing its implications with speakers from various institutions as well as experts from Ember in Asia. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded later to the Ember website. The Global Electricity Review is already uploaded, so welcome to look at that as we go through the presentation if you want to. If you're going to talk about this on social media, we'd ask you please to use the hashtag GER25. Now, we are going to have some time at the end of this for discussion, your comments, your questions. If you'd like to put any comments or questions at any time in the Q&A box, please, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and we'll just collect those and then we'll come to discuss some of them at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, let me introduce the two analysts who led this year's Global Electricity Review, Nicholas Fulgham and Ewan Graham, and they're going to talk you through the main findings. Nick.
Thank you so much, Richard, and welcome everyone to the launch of the Global Electricity Review 2025. My name is Nick Fulgham, and along with my colleague Ewan Graham, we'll be taking you through the findings in our latest report on the global power sector. So we'll start with a quick overview of what's inside the report this year. In the Global Electricity Review 2025, we provide the first comprehensive dataset and review on the global electricity system in 2024. We're taking a detailed look at the changes in the electricity sector in 2024. We provide analysis on the key trends that are shaping the global electricity transition. And we also include a deep dive into the electricity sector of major countries and regions, as well as the trends for different electricity sources. Now, to do this, we've collected and analyzed the latest 2024 data for 88 countries, but our data also covers 215 countries since 2000. And we also have coverage for 13 geographic and economic groupings like the EU, OECD, or ASEAN. And this coverage is what allows us to give the first accurate picture of the electricity transition last year on a global and on a country level. And we also published the first fully open data set of electricity generation in 2024. Now, in this presentation, we want to focus on 4 key trends that have shaped the global power sector in 2024. Clean power has surpassed 40% of global electricity generation for the first time since the 1940s, and this was driven by record growth in renewables. Solar power has cemented its role as the engine that's powering this transition, and it's the largest and fastest growing source of new electricity. Fossil generation still saw a small increase, but it was hotter temperatures compared to 2023 that were the main driver of this increase as they drove up demand for cooling. And lastly, we also show that clean generation is still set to outpace higher electricity demand growth, and this will set us on a path to falling fossil generation in the long term.
Thanks, Nick. So focusing on our first key finding here, clean electricity generation surpassed 40% of the global power mix in 2024. Now, on the left of this chart, we can see the growth of clean power generation over the last 2 decades, with wind and solar power especially showing rapid growth in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, on the right, we can see the share of generation coming from these low carbon sources. And the significant increase in renewable generation in 2024 meant that clean power supplied over 40% of global electricity generation for the first time since the 1940s. And for context, back then the electricity system was 50 times smaller than it is today. But I'd really like to stress just how big that renewables increase was in 2024. So here we can see the annual change in renewable power over the last 2 decades. And in 2024, we saw this major new record increase with substantial rises from solar, wind, and hydro generation. And in fact, that rise that we saw in 2024 was almost 50% higher than it was in 2022, which was the year of the previous record. And if we look at those bright green bars, the rise of solar generation, we can see that that contribution has grown consistently from year to year. And in 2024, solar added nearly 500 terawatt hours of electricity. That's roughly equivalent to the total renewable generation increase seen in the 4 years previously. So focusing on solar specifically now, its rapid rise has cemented the technology as the largest and fastest growing source of new electricity. And if we look at changes across all types of generation last year, we can see that solar added more than twice as much to global electricity generation as any other source. And comparing it to the increases that we saw in fossil generation, it's even more striking. It added more than 3 times as much as coal generation and almost 5 times as much as gas. But it's not just the largest source of new electricity, it's also still by far the fastest growing. Often, when technologies mature, their growth rate can slow down. However, with the record growth in 2024, solar has managed to maintain the high rate of growth of previous years and continues to grow exponentially, doubling roughly every 3 years. In fact, the growth in 2024 of 29% was actually the highest growth rate that we've seen in the last 6 years. So solar is showing no signs of slowing down. And something really striking is that the rapid rise of solar isn't just limited to a handful of countries, it's on display everywhere. So this chart shows how solar power has developed in lots of different countries over the last 5 years, with the light green dot representing 2019 and the dark green dot representing 2024. And as countries move further to the right of this chart, solar gains share in the electricity mix. As they move further up, solar produces more electricity in absolute terms. And we've broken this down into 6 buckets according to total solar generation to allow us to show some of the stories happening both across some large and small power sectors. Now, there's so much that I could highlight on this chart, but I just want to focus on sort of 2 or 3 trends for this presentation. So firstly, in some medium-sized power sectors like Chile, Greece, or Hungary, solar has quickly turned into the most important source of power. Solar is reaching shares above 20%, or in the case of Hungary, it supplied a quarter of electricity generation in 2024. In some of the biggest power sectors in the world, like China, Brazil, and Germany, the total amount of solar generation has reached new heights in recent years. Solar was the largest source of new generation in all 3 markets in 2024. And China's solar generation of 834 terawatt hours in 2024 is actually equivalent to more than the total annual electricity demand of major power sectors like South Korea or Canada. And the last thing I'd like to highlight on this chart is that geographically, we're seeing a really wide spread of solar uptake. So while solar power is rising in countries near the equator, like Brazil, it has also rapidly become a major part of some power sectors in much higher latitudes, such as Denmark, Poland, or the Netherlands. So if there's one overall message to take away from this, it's that the rapid boom of solar power is happening around the world. And one technology that is increasingly contributing to the growth of solar power is battery storage. In 2024, global installed capacity for battery storage nearly doubled. On the left of this chart, we can see how the price for battery storage has decreased significantly over the last decade, with a further dip of 20% from 2023 to 2024. And similarly to the dynamics with solar power, these cost reductions have enabled rapid growth in the battery storage market, with 69 gigawatts installed in 2024. For context, the total amount installed to date had been 86 gigawatts. And it's this combination of solar alongside battery storage that promises to be transformational to global power systems. as it will allow countries to integrate much higher shares of solar power into their electricity systems and benefit more from the cheap power that solar can provide.
Now, despite this record increase in solar power and renewables in 2024, we still recorded a small increase in fossil generation as well. But what our analysis is showing is that it was hotter temperatures compared to 2023 that were the main driver of this increase, as they pushed up the growth in electricity demand through additional cooling needs. Now here we can see the percentage growth in electricity demand in the last 10 years. And 2024 saw the highest demand growth, the third highest demand growth in the last decade. And demand increased by 4%, and this was substantially higher than in 2023 when it grew at around 2.6%. So this increase in renewables, which we can see on this bar on the left here, was able to meet 3/4 of the growth in demand. And solar's increase alone actually met 40%. But because that rise in demand on that gray bar on the right was so large, there was still an increase in coal and gas generation. And to put 2024 into perspective here, the rise in renewables and nuclear power together would have been enough to cover the increase in electricity demand in all but 3 years in the last 2 decades. So naturally, we wanted to know why demand growth was so high in 2024 and why it was so much higher than in 2023. So when we take a closer look at where this growth in electricity demand is coming from, we found that 2024 was a year where many major electricity sectors like China, the US, and India had really been affected by heat waves, while 2023 had been relatively mild for summer temperatures, especially in and around population centers. And we actually estimate that the difference in temperatures between 2024 and 2023 added more than 200 terawatt hours to electricity demand in 2024. And this really pushed up demand growth. Now, there is a general global upwards trend of temperatures and more frequent and severe heat waves as a result of climate change. But we want to be clear here that this dynamic in demand that we saw in 2024 is largely the result of short-term fluctuations of temperature conditions between the 2 years. We can also see here that clean electricity demand, which we can see on that green bar on the left, was enough to cover 96% of the non-temperature related growth in demand that we see on that gray bar on the right. And that means that if the temperature conditions in 2023 and 2024 had remained the same, then fossil generation would have also remained largely unchanged. But despite the small increase in fossil generation, the underlying trend of the rapid expansion of clean power, especially from solar power, still remains clear. And as a result, we find that clean generation is still set to outpace the growth in electricity demand and lead to reductions in fossil generation in the near future. Even when we're accounting for the temperature differences, 2024 still showed structural growth in electricity demand that was substantially higher than the average over the last 10 years. And this in part reflects the growth in emerging drivers of electricity demand from data centers, EVs, and heat pumps. Now, these sectors are contributing more than twice as much to demand growth as they did 5 years ago, and there's especially strong growth from EVs and data centers. If we look forward, the expectations for future growth in electricity demand have been revised upwards as a result of this. So in 2023, the IEA, in their World Energy Outlook, expected about 2.7% growth to 2030. But in last year's edition, so the 2024 Outlook, it revised those expectations up to 3.3% for the rest of the decade. So when we look at clean deployment and demand growth together, we actually see that the forecast for growth in clean electricity generation is outpacing even that faster rate of growth of 3.3% in electricity demand. And in fact, clean generation is growing fast enough to even meet 4.1% of demand growth. And that's faster than even that elevated growth in 2024 as a result of temperatures. Now, in the short term, that doesn't mean that fossil generation will fall in every single year as weather conditions can affect both supply and demand. But as we've seen in 2024, there can be impacts, for example, from heat waves. But this rapid deployment of clean electricity makes one thing really clear. We're really entering the start of a structural decline in fossil generation. And this dynamic between demand growth, clean generation growth, and fossil generation is especially apparent in China and in India. For many years, fossil generation, which we can see in red here, has been growing basically in line with electricity demand, as new demand was predominantly met by coal power. But in recent years in India, and even more so in China, the two countries have really decoupled that relationship between demand and fossil generation, thanks to a surge of clean power deployment. In 2024, China accounted for more than half of the global increase in solar and wind power. And while the specific year is really hard to predict, clean power in China is already growing fast enough that 2024 could be the year that fossil generation peaked. And in India, we found that solar and wind projects that are already under construction right now are enough to double capacity for wind and solar by 2028. And while we still expect coal generation to grow between now and 2030, it will likely do so at a slower pace than it has done so in the past. Now, other countries and regions like the US and Europe will really have to continue to build out their clean electricity. But it's this turnaround in China and in India, with falls in China and slower fossil generation growth in India, that will really tip the balance on the global trends in fossil generation. And this is what will lead to larger falls in the coming years.
Thanks, Nick. So sort of 4 key takeaways from this presentation. First of all, that clean power is cutting into fossil generation's market share and meeting the majority of demand growth, which helped it to surpass 40% of global electricity generation last year. Solar is already reshaping the electricity system and remains the largest and fastest growing source of new electricity. Hotter temperatures were the main driver of an increase in fossil generation last year, but looking to the longer term, clean generation is still set to outpace higher electricity demand growth, meaning the era of fossil growth is coming to an end, even in a world of fast rising demand.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, Ewan. Wonderful. Now, just a reminder that if you've got any questions or comments about what you've heard so far, please do put them in the Q&A box. And if there's anything that you want to put out on social media, please use the hashtag GER25. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Uta Collier, who's the Deputy Director of the Knowledge, Policy and Finance Centre at the International Renewable Energy Agency based in Abu Dhabi. But Uta joins us today from Bonn, Germany, and we'd love to get your reflections first, Uta, on what you've heard.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Richard. And first of all, congratulations to Ember for this very informative, presentation and the report. There's lots of great stuff in it. I just want to provide you with a few insights from some of our recent data on actually specifically renewable capacity additions, because today we heard about electricity generation. Of course, what is happening all the time at the moment is that we are having more and more renewable capacity installed. And IRENA, sorry, I'm just trying to get the slides up. IRENA, we have a statistics department, and they collect the data from all our member states. That's 170. And just 2 weeks ago, we brought out the latest capacity statistics. So this is for 2024, and it's not just estimates. This is the actual numbers, as good as they can be. The problem is we always have a bit of a lag with data, and especially electricity generation data for the whole year. But for capacity additions, we have pretty good data. And I wanted to specifically talk about it in relation to the tripling renewable energy capacity target, which was agreed at the COP in Dubai a year and a half ago. And obviously, as you know, we're in 2025 and that tripling target was for 2030. So we just got 5 years left. And it's really important that we see where we are along the route to that tripling. And yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. There is lots and lots of positive stuff going on, but we also have to keep in mind that what we're trying to do, I mean, the tripling didn't come out of nowhere. The tripling target is the kind of what our scenario said is needed on the way to getting to 1.5 degrees C. And as you will see in a moment, we're still falling short. So I'm afraid I can't just be totally positive. So there's lots of positive stuff to say, and there we totally agree with Ember on what we hear on the electricity generation side. Because when we look at the capacity addition side, I mean, as you can see, we've had phenomenal growth, not just in 2024, but also 2023, massive jump from previous years. I mean, overall, it's been a great story for the last 10 or so years anyway, but the last two have really been phenomenal. Where we now, last year we were at 585 gigawatts. This is all due to a range of conducive policies, geopolitical factors, etc. Of course, you know, where we are today, I think we need to really ask ourselves what the implications will be of these new trade tariffs. I think no one knows. Could go in many different ways. A lot more uncertainty now. I think, you know, last year we were more thinking along the lines, okay, you know, how long can China, say, sustain the phenomenal additions they've had in solar? Because, you know, where they're deploying the solar as well, there are various restrictions of how much of it you can actually get into the grid, because many of the sites, the regions are very far away from the demand centers, and they do need to really think about the storage side, etc., which they are doing. But potentially there could be a limit of how much you could add every year. But now we have totally different uncertainties. You know, what could this mean for the US, where deployment has also been quite high. So last year was certainly a great story on capacity additions. Of course, the solar story we already heard from the generation side as well, that over 3/4 of the capacity addition again was from solar, but also quite a lot on wind, obviously less for the other renewable sources, but still a pretty good story. And you know, for us also, it's really important to look at the solar for off-grid story, which, you know, is quite key for energy access. So it's great that we do see more deployment on that side as well. But there is that story which we've been stressing for some time now, this big discrepancy between, well, I mean, here it's on a regional basis, but you really need to look at it on a country basis. I mean, we all know that China is the big, great positive story. And of course, China also has a huge electricity demand. So inevitably, they should be the big deployers of renewables. But, you know, we mustn't forget that in this global picture, we have a lot of countries which have a massive energy access deficit. And IRENA, together with some of the other custodian agencies, we're currently working on the latest SDG 7 tracking report, which will come out in June. We're so far away from universal energy access on the electricity and clean cooking side. And renewables, and especially solar, provides such a fantastic way to provide energy access in areas which are tricky, where you might not get the grid connection easily, it's too expensive. And yet we are really seeing continuous lack of investment in many countries which have the largest energy access deficit. So I think it's really important to keep this in mind. okay, we're talking about the tripling target, and yes, you know, we're doing reasonably well. There is still a gap, and we are seeing lots of deployment in lots of important countries. But let's not forget, we do have this issue where we have many countries which have fantastic resource potential for renewables as well, which are just not seeing the investment because investors see it too risky, etc. So that's also something to be addressed. So overall, because my theme was the tripling, we're not quite on track. We do need to see this continuous acceleration of deployment. And now I would say we are unfortunately seeing yet more uncertainty. So we will have to see how this pans out. But I think overall, though, we do, I mean, renewables are certainly unstoppable, but they need to be deployed even faster. So I'll pass back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Ute, and especially thanks for bringing the Sustainable Development Goals into this crucial part of the picture. So for the remainder of this session, we are joined by a fantastic panel, and thanks to all of them for joining us. Kieran Burgess is a principal at Blunomy, which is a strategy consulting firm specializing in the energy transition with offices in Asia, Australia, and Europe. Professor Sunpeng Shi is a professor at the University of Technology in Sydney and president at the International Society for Energy Transition Studies, which is a global network of academics working on the energy transition. Also delighted to be joined by two of Ember's own analysts based in Asia, Dr. Dinitya Setiawati, who focuses on Southeast Asia and the energy transition there, and Neshwin Rodriguez, who specializes in India. So I'm going to ask you all, if I can, for just a very quick fire response, first of all, to what you've heard. In just about a minute or so, could you give us your initial thoughts on what you've heard and what it means, what it implies about the energy transition in Asia? And Kieran, I'll come to you first, if I may, please.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. I'll kick off by quoting three sets of numbers that I just saw. Globally, 96% of additional electricity demand was met from renewable generation, additional renewable generation. That was 81% in China, 33% on average over the last 6 years in India, but projected to be 75% in the next 6 years. So what we're seeing is that the additional demand, and that I think the chart bears it out, you know, coal-fired capacity addition and the generation dropping off from the demand curve. Fantastic. But I think the important thing is that we need to see more South-South collaboration and China and India perhaps taking the lead in transferring the best practices in terms of governance, in terms of industry structures, market models, financing models, etc., to a significant number of the developing countries in Asia, including those where the excess deficit is yet to be addressed, to ensure that their addition of renewable capacity and generation accelerates as well and carries everyone along. I think that's critically important, especially in what looks like an increasingly fracturing world.
Yes. Thanks very much, Kieran. Let me go to you, Professor Shi, if I may, for your quick fire reaction.
Yeah, I probably more look forward. We have done an excellent job, but I also, as Ute mentioned, that is still not enough. But looking ahead, we face more challenge given the political development in the US, as well as the ongoing tariff issue. I think for looking forward, we must work harder how to make sure that all those political and economic development wouldn't undermine the speed of the much needed renewable energy growth. And I think one specific issue, probably we try to make sure that the clean energy products, solar, wind, and others would not be undermined by the trade or tariff fightings among countries. Or put another way, we don't want renewable energy products and technology become victimized for this ongoing political and economic crisis. Yeah, that's my initial response.
Lovely, thanks. And just a reminder that if you've got any questions or comments, do put them into the Q&A box at any time, and we will pick them up later on. Danita, let me come to you from where you're sitting in Jakarta. How are things looking?
Yes, so I think in this developing Asia, we definitely need more awareness, understanding, and technical capacity about solar and clean technologies. And I know that solar has not been taken up a lot by ASEAN countries, but definitely progress is happening. In countries like Philippines, they have installed more solar capacity in the past 2 years than in the previous 5 years. And Vietnam's new development plan is also aiming for more clean energy technologies, and solar is still the priority for them.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, Nishwin.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So yeah, as I see it, Asia is really at the center of the electricity demand growth right now. I think one thing that I noticed was since 2000, electricity demand in this region has grown 4x, much faster than the global growth rate, and it's mostly because of China, India, and fast-growing economies like Indonesia and Vietnam. I mean, China and India together account for a big share of total global demand right now, and their growth rates again are much faster than the global average. So how these countries would meet that growing demand would be really important. And what I see is we see really encouraging signs. China, in fact, meets a big portion of the new demand through clean sources like solar and wind. And I think India is also expected to make that shift soon, right? But then we just need to ensure that this momentum continues. There are a few challenges that need to be addressed. I mean, we need to look at things like improving grid infrastructure, investing in kind of creating the right incentive mechanisms of battery storage, and also strengthening the finances of different stakeholders in the power system.
Great, thanks, Nishwin. Well, as you said there, the conversation in Asia really has to start with China. So let me come back to you, Professor Shi. This kind of remarkable progress that we're seeing in China, what do you think are the key policies that are really driving this?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think there are some unique probably policies, or I would say institutional environment in China that contribute to success. The first is the political commitment, which very strong given the carbon neutrality and the carbon peak. That I think many countries are committed on that, but in China it has been turned to real action. I think an associated issue is linked to China's institutions, because in China, once the top leader make the decisions, all the system will be mobilized, either sector, even private sector, government, and all the regional government and state-owned company more or less have to more like implement those things. I think that's one of the key factors behind or making it unique that such kind of commitment can be turned to functions or activities. I think another issue probably I haven't seen much discussion is the role of utility company, because in the early days I studied the solar bubble in Europe, including Germany and I think Spain. One of the problems that is the renewable energy developed so quick, particularly solar developed so quick as that created actually kind of bubble. But in China, all those kind of control or break balance factor is linked or in the hand of utility company, which not just accept whether how much you can produce, but also have the role actually to stabilize the grid. So that's the case, actually the utility company in the absence of electric market actually provide a much more balanced role to make sure that renewable energy is always accompanied with planning to stabilize this. I think one of the discussion in the 2 years ago, Mui from Ember, we published a journal report. We discussed that the flexibility, the issue, and the challenges. Then you realize that China, on the one hand, have a quick development renewable energy. On the other hand, they also developed a coal-fired power plant. The reason behind that, you need a contingency plan to make sure the renewable energy is stabilized. It look quite ironic, but that way actually make the renewable energy penetrate in the power grid or energy mix. without compromise reliability, which is highly demanded. I think those are the quite unique, but of course we need a feed-in tariff and other normal policy policy support and issue. But I think those are probably very unique policy and additional factor that contribute to such faster growth in China. Yeah, thank you, Richard.
Great, thanks very much. Now, Nishwin, we've seen a few headlines already today from Indian papers who are leading on the conclusion from the report that India has become the third largest generator of wind and solar electricity in the world, which is great. And we also saw the graph that Nick and Ewan presented of how China has started to decouple, and India may be at that point now of decoupling as well. What are going to be the crucial things that are needed in India in the coming years to really push forward on this transition?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think a bit of context, right? So India's per capita electricity consumption is well below the global average. So we expect that the demand will increase quite significantly, driven by economic growth, electrification, and as we are seeing rising demand for cooling. And meeting as much of these demand through renewables will help prevent fossil fuel lock-ins. I think in absolute terms, India has already done quite a lot of progress in terms of renewables, right? In my opinion, India is on track to meet the 2030 target of 500 gigawatts. I think two reasons why the growth has been so successful and is because India has a very well established and competitive market for investments in renewables, right? Secondly, if you look at the pipeline for solar and wind, it is quite strong, right? In fact, some of this pipeline has contributed to India meeting almost a third of its electricity demand growth in 2024 through renewables. But I think going forward, and coming to your question, if we need to scale up renewables and at the speed at which this is needed, a few things kind of need to fall into place. The first thing I would say is grid upgrades need to keep pace with RE additions, especially ensuring that there is timely access to new RE projects. We know that delays in connectivity could actually slow everything down. I think the second thing is considering the penetration level of renewables, and as Professor Rock mentioned, the next phase of RE, and particularly in India, won't be just around plain solar and wind. We'll need to add storage to ensure that renewables can meet peak demand and maintain reliability. And I think India has already started moving in this direction by including storage requirements in new tenders, especially by those through government agencies. And with this new type of dispatchable renewables, the risk profile of renewables is kind of changing. And so we need to ensure that this shift doesn't drive up cost because of the increase in cost of capital. And this could have an impact on, slowing down adoption. And I think finally, one of the big drivers would be the role of domestic manufacturing. India already has a very strong wind manufacturing capacity, and is rapidly trying to, increase its capacity in the whole solar supply chain. So scaling up local production won't just support, the policy objective of energy security. It will also help meet industrial goals. It will create jobs, and it will make the transition even more attractive for policymakers in India.
Thanks, Neshwin. Yes, it's been fascinating. I mean, the Chinese story of combining manufacture with deployment is, of course, well known, but it's been really fascinating to watch that taking place in India as well. Danita, let me come to you. In some ways, this wind and solar revolution is a little bit passing ASEAN by, isn't it? With a few exceptions, the deployment of solar in ASEAN countries is quite slow. What's happening, and what's needed to reverse it?
Yes, thank you, Richard. So actually, solar and wind are not natural to ASEAN countries, right? We have hydro-rich countries in ASEAN. So unlike Europe, which is long history of wind power, solar and wind are really new technologies for ASEAN. And I think what needed is just to install this awareness and the renewable energy market in ASEAN, saying that renewables can really drive the economic growth of these ASEAN countries. And also we need, like India, like Nashvin said, we need grid updates. We also need some flexibility measures to ensure that we can maximize the use of solar and wind. And with hydro decline, we need to explore the right clean technologies, including storage, and not focusing on these dangerous deflections like some ASEAN countries are doing on right now.
Thank you. Thanks, Denisa. Kieran, let me come to you. A few people, including Neshwin, have mentioned finance and one of the keys being to keep the cost of capital low. There are various mechanisms for trying to do that, some of them connected with public institutions such as multilateral development banks, some of them private sector. What are going to be the most important things that we're going to be hearing about, do you think, in terms of keeping the costs down of this transition?
Thanks, Richard. Let me kick off the answer to that by making a slightly controversial statement, saying that there's absolutely no dearth of finance, but there's a whole wall of money sloshing around looking for bankable projects, but can't find them. So what's important to keep in mind that capital is has an expectation of a return, and it prices risk. When the two don't meet, when capital can't find the risk-adjusted returns at once, it will not deploy, and that's the barrier that we all talk about, right? So in this context, trying to solve that problem by applying so-called innovative financing mechanisms by whatever means to bring down just the cost of capital, in my mind, is a bit like applying a Band-Aid to a fracture. It's considering where we are and the urgency of building out some of the infrastructure and keeping the momentum of the transition going. It could be applied in very limited quantums, with innovative capital structures, perhaps with innovative products, perhaps with involvement of the MDBs, as you mentioned, and also some of the sovereign wealth funds, right? Indonesia's newly inaugurated Danantara, I think, is a great example of this, where the stated objective is to be driving investments into key sectors of the economy to lift the overall economic growth rate up to a sustained 8%. This is the stated objective of President Prabowo, and that's definitely possible. It could take in first loss tranches, it could drive pilots, etc., and build that. But ultimately, we have to understand that the underlying drivers of the risk, which are often structural, especially in the emerging market developing countries, have to be addressed, and that needs the public sector and the private sector to work together to sustainably dismantle some of these barriers, and then the finance will flow very freely at competitive rates.
Great, thank you very much, Kieran. Let's turn now to some of the questions that we've had in from you, and there's about 15 minutes left here, so if you've got many comments, any questions, please do put them in the box. Now, Uta, I'd like to come to you first for the question that's at the top of the box, and of course it's a question that could have been asked on any year in the last sort of decade or so, thanks to the graph that Nick and Ewan showed us earlier about the sort of steady exponential rise of solar. Do you see solar maintaining high growth rates in the next 5 years, and why or why not? I think Uta might have just stepped away from the microphone. So let me come to who would like to take that question. Maybe Rock. Maybe this is one for you, especially with China being at the forefront of this. Do you think we'll see this sort of steady exponential curve, upward curve of solar being maintained in the next 5 years?
I think that there are two issues. One is actually normative issue, whether we need, and I think that the answer will be yes, we need. If we really want to triple the renewable energy and achieve all those carbon neutral goals, regardless of when it is, I think in China's case they also need. And second is that if we look at it realistically whether it can be, I would think that it will be very optimistic to think that this high growth can be continued. For one of the issue is actually the grid stability, as I mentioned early the grid company play a big role, try to balance the demand for renewable energy project and stability. And we also see actually the Ember report suggests that there are a lot of increase in the battery storage company, but compared with the renewable energy development and battery, still probably far away from that. I think if we want have a long-term growth even up to 2030, we really need flexibility technology to be wrap up to match what is needed in order to integrate the variable renewable energy. So it will be contingent. I think it's the simple way. It will be contingent on the storage technology. I think I see the ultra she's back. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Rock. Yeah, also just a quick take, if you would, on the question at the top of the Q&A box now. Do you see solar maintaining its remarkable growth rate over the next 5 years or so?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a difficult question, I think, in the situation we are at the moment. I would say, I mean, everyone has always underestimated what solar can do. So I think there will be a remarkable, yes, it will continue to grow very fast, but how that will pan out in some certain countries now, which have been very instrumental in pushing this growth, I think is a bit of an unknown at this stage. Yeah, but let's be optimistic on solar, definitely.
Yes, thank you. Let's stay with you, Uta, if we may. There's a question specifically for you. In many regions with low electrification rates, especially in parts of Africa, distributed renewables like solar microgrids are rapidly expanding. On the other hand, we're seeing some governments talking about an expansion of gas generation as well, which of course speaks to a nationwide traditional Western model type. So how do you think this balance is going to evolve in coming years?
That is also a very tricky question. There is a lot of debate around this. I mean, some people would argue, well, who are we to tell countries, say in Africa, who have their own gas reserves, not to develop them and use them for industrialization, which is, of course, what we did in Europe, in the US, everywhere else. I mean, I would just point to the many benefits renewables have for these countries. I mean, okay, so there are some countries in Africa, especially, who have their own gas reserves, but many others who don't and who would have to import gas for industrialization, and clearly renewables. Importing gas, of course, from the international market, and that's for countries which are already heavily indebted. So renewables do have many benefits there, and of course, for the off-grid, etc. I think we will see, of course, we will see some industrial development based on gas in many of these countries, but it's up to all of us to also show the benefits of renewables and show how they can play a role in green industrialization in these countries. That's what we tend to focus on. So it's not so much, telling people not to use gas, but it's sort of, okay, here's what renewables can offer.
Thanks. Also, let me bring in Danita here, because it's not just in Africa where distributed renewables are an issue. It is in parts of Asia as well. And I know you've worked on issues such as energy access and development in the past. Danita, what's your perspective on this as how it affects Asia?
Yeah, so I think distributed renewables is very important, especially for Indonesia. And it's not only for the people that do not have energy access, but also maybe for industries that is located far from the demand center. I'm thinking of Indonesia and the nickel processing companies in other islands where the main grid is located. So distributed renewables could also support for these captive renewables. Right. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. We've got one fairly factual question here, and Nick, perhaps I can come to you on this one. What percentage of countries in the world are on a proper transition phase, i.e. we're seeing clean terawatt hours up and fossil terawatt hours down, versus what percentage are in the additive phase where both are going up?
Yeah, so globally, obviously, we still have had another year where there was a little bit of an increase in fossil generation, but the number of countries actually points the other direction. So there are 115 countries now that have falling fossil generation. Now, most of those, it is because clean power is increasing and demand is holding either steady, is growing, or is falling slightly. There are some of those countries where it's largely because of falling demand, but that's a minority. So 115 countries, and those together already make up 39% of global electricity demand. So at nearly 40% of the global electricity system, we're already in a phase where we're declining fossil generation. And the tipping point I was talking about earlier with China and India is so important here because it might be 39% now, but if you add China and India to that over the next 5 to 10 years, then that's 79% of global electricity demand being in systems with declining fossil generation. And this is really what we mean by the tipping point. China and India have so much leverage over the global trend in this scenario that what happens there is really the defining characteristic. The one caveat I would give on that is we need to make sure that the countries that have so far driven a lot of the transition outside of China and India, obviously China being one of the leaders, the US, Europe, they need to continue their build out of clean electricity. They can't sit back now because we do need this concerted effort. Those countries still are 39% of global electricity demand. So their importance doesn't just go away. They need to work towards the same direction.
Great. Thanks, Nick. We have a question here from which I'd like to put to you, Neshwin. We talk a lot at Ember about renewables as a batch, but of course you've got different types of renewables, some which are dispatchable and some which are by their very nature variable. You were talking earlier about the issues that India will face in terms of integrating the variable renewables at higher penetrations into the grid. So do you see that there are actually any inherent limits for wind and solar growth, or with enough grid extension, with enough flexibility and so on, do you think that there really is no limit?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between variable RE and dispatchable RE like hydro, right? So with dispatchable RE, you actually can balance some of the variable RE. But I think as countries reach a certain penetration level of, say, solar, right? So you have a lot of solar generation during the day. The demand for that electricity during that time period would be kind of limited. I think we're seeing this with, and they kind of reflect in, negative prices and so on. I think in India, especially, we've seen that the demand for just plain solar generation capacity is diminishing a bit. So there is a demand for, solar capacity with some level of dispatchability, right? So you need some amount of non-solar hour peak demand, right? So I think that distinction would kind of also define the pace at which you can kind of add RE, right? Because you need people demanding for a certain characteristics in a generation capacity. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Neshwin. I'd like to come to the very last question on the list here from Charlton Marterum, and it's one I think that I'd like to turn to you, Kieran, on it. The sort of synergy between investment and policy making really lies at the very heart of this. And you were speaking earlier about there being actually a tide of capital that's basically waiting for projects that it can get into. So, bearing in mind what Nick and Ewan have done and everything that they've analysed and what we're reporting here today, what do you think needs to be communicated to policymakers in order that they set the right conditions for the renewables growth to continue?
I think the first key message would be exactly what I said earlier, that there is no dearth of capital, but you've got to make your country, your sector, investable and attractive to this pool of capital that is there. This is global, right? This pool of capital is extremely mobile. It can go anywhere in the world, and it will go anywhere in the world which it finds is best suited to their investment preferences and return expectations. So I think first and foremost is to flip that message around and say, you've got to address certain things. There's more than enough waiting. The second would be, I will come back to what I said earlier, talking about South-South partnerships, and really in the context of Asia, I think China and India should be taking the lead to partner with other developing countries of Asia because both these countries, and there's a reason why both of them are able to add capacity at this pace and keep going with it, and that's many years of experience with this transition. It is not something that happened overnight. I started off my consulting career in 2007 in India. India's really reform started sometime in the late 80s. So that's the kind of, we're talking almost 40 years now, 35 to 40 years. So that's the kind of built-up experience that is there to disseminate that to policymakers, to say that, listen, learn from some of these things that are working in other developing country contexts. You don't have to leapfrog to where the developed countries have gotten to. That's probably a chasm too far to try and bridge at one leap. I think these two things is what's immediately needed.
Great, thanks, Kieran. Uta, can I come to you for a very quick response on that? We're nearly out of time, but if you've got a quick take on what you think are the sort of key messages that need to be communicated effectively to policymakers.
Sorry, just getting my audio back. I think we need to still get better at communicating the socioeconomic benefits and broader environmental benefits of renewables. I mean, this is something which we've worked on a lot in IRENA. I don't know, there still seems to be this thing that people recognize, yeah, renewables nice and CO2 fine, but they're still not entirely convinced that, well, A, you can compensate for jobs lost elsewhere, B, that you can use it as a way for industrialization as well. I think that's a big challenge that many countries think, yes, fine for, adding to overall electricity production, but not for heavy industry, etc. And of course, it is complex because for that, we need to think about flexibility options in green hydrogen, etc., etc. And that will also have broader benefits. So it's this big story we need to keep on telling and convincing policymakers, especially that in a time of crisis, it's still something you will continue with.
So see the big picture and see all the benefits. Well, thank you everyone who's joined us for this Ember webinar. I'd particularly like to thank our guest, Professor Sunpeng Rokshi from Sydney, Uta Collier, who's joined us from IRENA, Kieran Verghese from Blunomy, Danita Setiawati, Neshwin Rodriguez, and Nick Fulgham from Ember for all the presentations and so on. Also like to thank Ewan, who had to leave us halfway through to do a radio interview. Thanks to all the Ember technical staff who made all of this happen, and thanks to you for joining. Do keep reading the report. Do keep putting stuff on social media today. #GER25, and I guess we'll see you in about a year's time for the next Ember Global Electricity Review.
Thank you. Bye bye.